So now, remember, this is connective tissue, so it's their living parts, the cells that are floating or reside in an extracellular matrix. And in blood, the extracellular matrix, as we talked about, is plasma. Extracellular matrix. And it's about, that's a kind of a bullet point, 92% water. And plus it's got a variety of substances. We'll talk about them. And its function is to transport nutrients and gases, and it regulates fluid and electrolyte balance, and helps in maintaining the pH, the acidity of the blood. So other substances. These include different types of plasma proteins. And these are not used for energy. Like the chicken that you eat is used for energy, or the steak or whatever. Or the soy for the vegetarian. Plasma proteins, not used for energy. The most abundant of these are called albumins. And they're about 60% of all the plasma proteins that are circulating. And they have a really important role in maintaining what's called colloid osmotic pressure in the blood. This is a term that you should probably familiarize yourself. Essentially what this does is it pulls water and fluids into the blood. I'm going to totally run out of room. Into the blood or the plasma. And it plays a big role in helping maintain a relatively large role in maintaining your blood pressure. And another type are called globulins. So this is albumins. Globulins. This is about 36% of the proteins. And there are alpha and beta globulins and they transport lipids and vitamins in the plasma. Lipids and vitamins. And then there's another type called a gamma globulin. And this acts as a type of antibody. And there's one more, but I've obviously run out of room. Plasma protein continued. Fibrinogen. This makes up about 4% of the plasma proteins. And as you'll see here in a minute or so, it's part of the blood clotting, say, cascade or process. The gases, of course, those are going to include oxygen, and carbon dioxide. We'll talk more about how these two gases are exchanged with the air in the respiratory system. And then plasma nutrients. These can include amino acids and sugars, different monosaccharides. Can you remember saccharides? And nucleotides, which are nucleic acids, or will be nucleic acids. And then lipids. There are other non-protein, they call it non-protein nitrogenous. Which means that they contain nitrogen substances. And for example, this is going to include urea and uric acid. Creatine and creatinine. Most of these are metabolic byproducts as you digest your food and burn them in your mitochondria. Non-protein nitrogenous substances. And then the last group are the electrolytes. This includes, we always talk about sodium, don't we? Sodium and calcium, we've talked much about. Ca2+. There's also potassium and magnesium. Chloride, which is an ion of chlorine. Another one we're going to talk about in the respiratory system is bicarbonate. That's a big one. Phosphate, sulfate, and then all of these have a role in maintaining osmotic pressure in the pH. So they help with the maintaining the osmotic pressure and pH of the blood. I did want to do a little side note here. We talked about the albumins and the colloid osmotic pressure on this slide right here. So if you remember, I think it was like probably day 1 or day 2 of the semester, we talked about the different passive transport mechanisms. So if you have your blood with the dissolved albumins in there, by osmosis, remember, and this is the tissues out here. So this is blood, and these are the tissues. By osmosis, water diffuses from, do you remember? From high concentration to low concentration. So because these are the albumins again, because the water concentration is lower here and higher here, water is going to be pulled into the blood. If you didn't have, let's compare that down here without, let's put maybe just a couple in the tissues, the water from your blood might actually flow out. So it helps maintain the blood pressure inside the blood vessels rather than all that water basically leaking out of the blood, which would be disastrous and deadly. Okay, a large part of this class, at least the physiology part, is about maintaining homeostasis. And the homeostasis of blood is called hemostasis. So hemostasis are actions that stop bleeding, that help stop bleeding when the blood vessels are damaged or broken. One of the excuse me, one of the first things that happens is a blood vessel spasm. Or a vasospasm. And this is when the smooth muscle around the blood vessels contracts. To kind of like shut off the bleeding, to let's say slow the blood loss. This is a really short-term reaction, but it's quick. But it's basically immediate because we need something until the longer lasting stuff starts to kick in, such as a platelet plug starts to form. Oh, look at this numbers. This looks like it might be a short answer question on an exam. Explain to me the steps of hemostasis. So this is when the platelets, remember the fragments of cells, they stick to the edges of the damaged blood vessel and basically start to kind of pile up and keeps the blood from, or helps keep the blood from bleeding out. Stick to the edges. Broken blood vessels to sort of patch it up. So this helps prevent blood loss. And then finally, you'll have blood coagulation. Coagulation, which is the most effective, but it takes a second. And it's a bit complicated. I'll just add this here. Blood coagulation is a positive feedback mechanism, one of the two or very, very few that we've talked about. The other one, remember, were contractions during birth. This is the other one, positive feedback mechanism. So when you start to coagulate, it causes even more coagulation, which is good because it helps keep you alive, right? So this is coagulation. Continued coagulation. It involves a very complicated cascade of what are called clotting factors. Of 12 different clotting factors, and they're all numbered and named. If you're going to med school, you'd have to know a lot of these steps, but for the purposes of our class, I'm going to try, and you're going to think, I'm going to try to make it simple, but you're going to think this is simple. So this all starts with tissue damage. And when you get tissue damage, your body releases a factor called thromboplastin. And in turn, thromboplastin causes the production of Prothrombin Activator. So Prothrombin Activator converts a factor. Prothrombin is at factor 2. Not that you have to know that, but just to kind of give you a reference. It converts prothrombin into thrombin. And guess what? It uses calcium. Can't escape calcium, right? Thrombin, in turn, converts fibrinogen, which is one of the proteins we just talked about that's dissolved in your blood, to fibrin with the help of calcium. And then fibrin, in turn, starts to form a net. It's like a protein net, basically, that catches red blood cells and forms a clot. Okay. So thromboplastin causes the body to produce prothrombin activator. Prothrombin activator activates prothrombin, right? That's why it's called prothrombin activator. Prothrombin is converted to thrombin. Fibrinogen, thrombin helps convert fibrinogen into fibrin, and then the fibrin starts to form the clot. Okay. 2 words: flash cards. After the clot is formed, you don't want it to stay there forever. So the clot healing process, let's call it, basically involves breaking down the fibrin net. Fibrin clot, or the net. And we also need to damage. We need to repair the blood vessels that are broken. By the fibroblasts. By fibroblasts, basically they produce a fibrous connective tissue that seals up the wound. If this does not happen, that can be a problem. Normally the blood flow will prevent clots from forming where they shouldn't. If they don't, it's called a thrombus. And this is a abnormal clot formation in a vital blood vessel. Vital blood vessel. And it can cause tissue damage. Also known as an infarction. Infarction. T-I-O-N, infarction. So, for example, you can have a coronary thrombus. Coronary thrombus. And these are the blood vessels that basically deliver oxygen to the heart itself. So if you get a clot in one of those things, you get what's known as a heart attack. You can also have a cerebral thrombus, which affects the blood vessels going to the brain. And when you cut off the blood flow to the brain, you're cutting off the oxygen to the brain, of course, and that causes what's known as a stroke. You can also get a clot that breaks off from where it should be and then goes to somewhere it shouldn't. So a clot that breaks loose and starts to circulate around. Starts circulating, which can be problematic as well. It'll lodge into smaller, narrow vessels and impede blood flow. Can block blood flow in smaller vessels. So, for example, you can get a pulmonary embolism. Pulmonary meaning the lungs. Pulmonary embolism. It's a clot that blocks blood flow to the lungs. Or part of the lungs, anyway. To part of the lungs. Usually the clot starts somewhere in the legs and works its way up the body. Some other problems associated with blood and blood vessels. There's a condition called atherosclerosis. Sclerosis. And this is when fatty deposits build up in the arteries. Up on the arterial walls. So of course, if you have a diameter of something that should allow a lot of blood to go through, and then all of a sudden you shrink that diameter of that thing, well, now blood's gonna have a little bit of trouble getting through there. It can also increase the so this slows blood flow. So you get a, let's just say a narrower diameter, which should be kind of obvious, hopefully. Diameter in the vessel, and it decreases the blood flow for one, and increases the chances of a blockage. And one more problem is hemophilia. Hemophiliacs are people that are lacking or have less of one of these clotting factors. So if they have, and it's not any of these that are on here, but there are other factors involved. Like I said, there's 12 of them. You're only seeing a couple of them here. If they have less of one of these factors, then the whole cascade kind of like doesn't work like it should. So there's multiple types of this disorder. The most common are called, most common are hemophilia A, and hemophilia B. And these are both genetic, and they're associated with the X chromosome. So these are genetic. Genetic. So they're inherited, is basically what that means. And they're on the X chromosome. So, which again, women, if let's say that X with an N means it's normal, and with an H, this is really not how you would do this, but this would be a carrier of hemophilia. But if a guy has that, then he's got the disease, right? So this is more common in men. Because it's on the X chromosome. Women need 2 copies of the diseased X chromosome in order to have hemophilia. And basically what this is, hemophiliacs, they have reduced production of factor VIII. Factor VIII. And these have a reduced production of factor IX. So there are companies that make basically fake, it's not really fake, but they I believe they make it through bacteria, where they insert a gene into a bacterium and then they just grow the bacteria and then they make the factory. I believe that's how it's done. But there are big companies like Bayer, the aspirin company. They've got a big facility up in the Bay Area that makes factor VIII for hemophiliacs. All right. One more thing, and then we'll be done. And this is a really long lecture.